titled it Transition, Disintegration, and Regional Rivalry. And essentially, we're trying to sort of capture where we are, what has happened in the last 5 years, what does it really mean in the larger scheme. I mean, since 2011, there was obviously a lot of hope for this region, for autocrats were falling, but then very quickly, hopes for democracy or even democratizations have largely crashed. States have actually collapsed in many countries, Libya, Yemen, Syria, and others. Sectarianism has spread almost like a cancer in Syria and Iraq. And with all of these things, there's major rivalry taking place, obviously not unrelated to all of the above. So it's really all these things, again, happening at the same time in the Arab world. And I thought maybe we sort of make sense of what's really going on. And we ask our colleague, first Paul Salem, to actually tell us more about the dynamics of the transition and disintegration in the Arab world. What does it mean conceptually? How do you see it on a sort of more historical sort of perspective? And then we have Emile Hokayem, who's going to, in fact, look at more sort of zooming in on the rivalry. How can we understand this rivalry between Iran on one hand, Saudi Arabia on the other hand, maybe using Syria as a sort of a case study. Just before I give them the floor, Paul Salem is the Vice President at the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. And Paul has written and authored several books and many, many articles on the region and Lebanon. He was a founding director of the Carnegie Middle East back in 2006, I believe, to 2013. And obviously, and more importantly, he was the founding director of the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies for many, many years. He was the director in the 90s. I had the pleasure to work with Paul back then, so I'm really glad to have Paul back home in more ways than one. Emile Hokayem is a senior fellow for Middle East security at the International Institute for Strategic Studies based in Manama, but travels a lot in the region. Has also authored many books, including the recent one on the Syria's uprising and the fracturing of the Levant. And he obviously writes regularly and has on the region. Paul, I'll give you 15 minutes to reflect on your dynamics. Thanks.
Thank you, Sami, and it's a pleasure to be back at LCPS. The title of my remarks is Lost in Transition, the dynamics of transition, disintegration, and resurrection in the Arab world, because in the long term, I do believe in that. Are we in transition? And how can we tell if we are in transition? I would say the amount of conflict, collapse, change, and turbulence that we see is a symptom of the shifting of major tectonic plates. It's proof that we're going somewhere, and certainly in a very deep and major way. Are we lost in this transition? Yes and no. I say we are lost because there is no major leadership or party or regional order that is pointing a sustainable way forward. So we seem to be عم نتخبط, as we say in Arabic, in different versions of moving backwards and forwards. So in a way, we are lost in transition. At the same time, in my remarks, I'm going to say that in the long term, we should not be lost, because I do think we're moving in the long term in a particular direction. Why are we in transition? Why is it that these tectonic plates are shifting? I look at it basically as a series of shifts of power shifts. Power is moving. And as power moves, political orders, security orders, economic orders, social orders, cultural orders are shaken. There's a power shift from states to societies. States used to be able to control information, mobility, many, many different things. Through changes in technology and mobility and the rest, you see a shift of power from state to society. There's a shift of power, to my mind, from community control to individual empowerment. Again, technology, education, mobility. Individuals are contesting power with communal orders that used to be quite strong. There is a continuing shift of power from men to women in a society that was utterly dominated by men in all fields, an empowerment of everybody, obviously including women, which shakes up all kinds of orders. A shift of power from the old to the young. Young people in the 50s were very much sort of under control in terms of their mobility, information, empowerment, and we've obviously seen how that's completely changed. We also see a shift of power from global powers to regional powers. This was a region that was dominated for much of the 20th century either by colonial powers, by superpowers, and we are living through a decline of sort of global power control and the rise with much tectonic shifts of regional powers. So change is happening in the tectonic plates in a major way. And the first and to be expected result of change is often conflict, system collapse, chaos. That is to be expected because an old order which prevailed over an old power distribution, when it begins to crumble, obviously, it's not going to be immediately replaced by a new structure or easily reformed. It will fight back, it will collapse, and you will see conflict and collapse first before anything else. Obviously, authoritarian systems we see throughout the region are confronting these attempts at these forces of change and trying to keep things in place. We see a ferocious patriarchal response to try to preserve sort of the male patriarchal control over women. You see an extreme case in ISIS. You see other examples in other places. Some countries simply have not been able to cope with the change and have collapsed as states. The levels and time cycles of these changes and these transitions are of various lengths. There are centuries-long transitions, which really we're still living through, which is transition from 17th, 18th century social, cultural norms and structures to a 21st century question mark. Where are we headed? But very long civilizational change from religious society, very rural, very patriarchal, to something profoundly different. That's something that you can almost measure in centuries. There's a level of transition which we point to a lot, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the state order, which you can measure in 1 century. And that is really the transition of imperial orders to nation states. Some are surviving, some are collapsing, new attempts to build new structures, and that is a medium length cycle. There's a transition of regimes. Gaddafi as a regime lasted for a while, collapsed. The Assad regime is struggling to survive. Those can be measured in shorter years. The region itself is transitioning from a superpower-controlled region that lasted maybe all the way up to the 80s and 90s to one really where the main players today are Iran, Saudi Arabia, as Emile will explain to us, and Turkey, a regional order which is attempting to take shape. This process, with all of these profound transitions, we are perhaps living through kind of the perfect storm of transition and change where everything is being questioned somewhere. And some of the fundamentals that are being questioned is, at the political level, what constitutes a nation? Where do we draw borders? Is it along ethnic grounds? Is it Sykes-Picot? Is it sectarian? What the Kurds have a claim, Sunni Shi'i tensions. So the very definition of what constitutes a nation, who lives together, is under question. The nature of the state, what should a state be? The Islamic State has a certain approach. The Assad regime, I would say, has a Hobbesian approach, kind of a Thomas Hobbes Leviathan approach, that the ruler is the one who's the most brutal and who is the least bound by any scriptures. The Arab Spring proposed one wing of it kind of a liberal democratic proposition. Muslim Brotherhood proposed a conservative, somewhat democratic Islamic order. But what seems to be winning the day is a kind of an authoritarianism, conservative authoritarianism, either monarchical from Morocco to the GCC, or sort of the military authoritarianism that we see in Egypt. So the nature of the state is very much in question. The nature of society, deep conflicts between secularists and Islamists in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Syria. This is partly healthy. These are debates that need to be contested. I've mentioned already the definition within society of male-female relations, a society that is effectively patriarchal, being challenged and attempts to move in a more inclusive direction, both between men and women and between older patriarchs and younger generations. At the regional level, as I've said, a contestation of who defines the regional order. Iran's Revolutionary Guards have a vision. The GCC has another vision. For a while, Turkey had a vision of how it would dominate the region. All of these are in open contest as to what our region will look like. When we look at all the profundity of challenge and transition and change, and if you just think of what the West went through and how long and how violent it was, in a way, maybe things don't look too bad. It took the West 4 or 5 centuries to work through all of these issues. Just 70, 80 years ago, Europe was much worse than the Middle East was today. Wars that killed over 80 million people, genocide, radical groups, the Nazi movement, mass slaughter. And yet, while Europe was much worse than the Arab world is today, they were able to work through it, and after 1945, work through a lot of these issues and come to a safer spot. That's what sort of gives me hope that the conflict and the chaos we're seeing now is a symptom of change, and that change should go in a certain direction, and that there's hope possibly at the end of the tunnel. Where are we going in this transition? I would say in the short term, which could last for many years and several decades, I think chaos, conflict, backlash will probably be the dominant definition of what goes on. But in the long run, I think these forces, when you look at the power shifts, they impose at the end of the day that there's only one combination of systems that can manage these new power distributions. I'm reminded of the opening line of Anna Karenina. Tolstoy says, "All happy families are happy in the same way. Unhappy families are unhappy in different ways." What I mean by that at the end of the day, and it may take decades, the new distribution of power that is much more widespread in society, that is less patriarchal, that is more generationally inclusive, the only type of systems that will be sustainable in the long run are political systems that are inclusive and accountable, social systems that are inclusive and pluralist, and economic systems that are productive, job-creating, and to some degree distributive in an acceptable way. Now these types of systems could have a monarchical phase in the sense that monarchies could evolve, accountable systems with all of these things and some kind of constitutional monarchy. They could have an Islamic face or an Islamist face like we had maybe a decade ago in Turkey, seemed to be moving in that direction but now has moved away. It could have a liberal democratic face, but the systems, the technology of government and economic production and social structure, in the long run, I think the other approaches will not be sustainable. Why aren't we going in that direction? Because indeed we are not actually currently going in that direction. One is entrenched authoritarian states with lots of petrodollars that are resisting this change. No regional encouragement When Central and Eastern Europe threw off Soviet authoritarianism, they had the European Union to guide them through the process of at least democratic transition and economic change. We don't have that. Rather, we have Iran and Saudi Arabia, two petrostates, hyper-conservative, pushing in the other direction. And as I said, we have, as social structures, long inherited religious, cultural, patriarchal traditions that are also resisting. We also have a hollowed out political space. We have revolutions without parties, without leaders, without groups that can take, put things as visions and move forward. That is largely because this authoritarian systems hollowed out those spaces. But also, I think we're at a moment in Arab history or Arab modern times where there's a very little of a vision of what our future should look like. I often say that in the past, we had a future. The 1920s have a vision of what the Arab future would look like. The Arab nationalists, the 50s and 60s, had a vision of where we want to go. Right now, we know what we don't want. We rebelled against authoritarianism, against social injustice, and so on, without a very strong vision of how our societies need to change. And this is something that I think is not restricted to the Arab world. There's a fantastic book by a Russian author called Svetlana Boym. It's a beautiful book that I recommend to all of you. It's called The Future of Nostalgia. And in it, she talks about this phase. She says that the 20th century began with utopian visions about the future and how we were going to change the world and how things were going to be built in a different way, and yet the 20th century ends and the 21st century begins with intensive nostalgia for images of things and glories that were in the past. She's mainly talking about the Putin era in Russia and the idea of reclaiming past glories. It could apply to Donald Trump and make America great again, some kind of, history. But it applies also very much to ISIS, which is claiming that there is some glorious past that can be reclaimed. It can be applied to the Egyptian situation today, recalling sort of Nasserist glories and trying to go back in that direction. And Boym in this book makes the important point that nostalgia as a political force becomes very powerful when change is happening very quickly. And people are very confused, and people are very sort of panicked. She points to the Nazi movement as a time when, because of the intense change in Germany, there was a ferocious longing to something that has gone past. So I think we're suffering from a lack of a clear vision to move forward. I will end with a few comments about the road that we are not taking. To my mind, in the long run, this road will come back. I think the young generation's choices, and you see where they want to be, it might take a generation or more to come to fruition, but I think there is a path forward, even though we are not on it now. This is the work of generations, and I think it's important from think tanks and intellectuals and so on to do the early work today of thinking about what the future should look like, even though it's not being realized very much in countries that we're looking at now. Because the power shifts that I talked about, those are permanent, those cannot be reversed, and they will have expression in political, economic, and social systems. The few things I would point to is, one, stabilize the regional order. I think that's the one that's causing the most instability. And that's what we'll be hearing a lot from Emile about, the proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia and other players is tearing the region apart. There is a way to stabilize and create a regional order. With a stable regional order, then we can begin to de-escalate ongoing civil wars, which are largely proxy conflicts, and get back to the business of rebuilding stability and trying again to move forward. There is no alternative to rebuilding and reclaiming a Westphalian-style state system, even though some of them have failed. ISIS and others, and Iran or whoever is trying to propose other ways of doing business. But I think rebuilding and resuscitating or reforming the state system is essential for societies to begin to move forward. It's also essential to reclaim ungoverned space from terrorist groups like ISIS and others. Beyond that, regional economic integration, at the end of the day, without jobs, without growth, stability is very hard to maintain. And there's a lot of lost opportunity economically in the region that can be reclaimed through economic integration regionally and reforms and orientation to the global economy. And finally, continuing to push for civil society, governance, democratization, which I think at the end of the day are the only sustainable mechanisms. Thanks, and sorry for maybe taking a bit longer than I should have.
No, thanks, Paul. Thanks for this tour de force and injecting a sense of optimism. Emile, you're going to tell us about the rivalry. Everyone wants to know what's going on. The Saudi-Iranian rivalry, that's the talk of the town. Over Syria, that's even more sort of intense. People sort of frame it in all sort of ways, two regional hegemonic powers fighting over the region. Some reduce it to Sunni Shia framework, which I'm not so sure how useful that is. I'd like to get your sense on that. Could you tell us more about sort of the drivers of this sort of conflict or rivalry? Thanks.
Thank you, Sami, and thanks to LCPS for hosting me today. You may not believe it, but it's the very first time I speak in Lebanon, my home country, on those topics, I know. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to pepper my presentation with references to great work of Russian literature and thinking, so don't judge me too harshly on that, or Paul, you can jump in anytime you want. Okay, Paul gave us what I think is a brilliant meta-narrative of where we are today and the various forces. And if I can summarize, before getting into the topic of Syria and the Saudi-Iranian rivalry, what I think are the key fault lines that are basically shaping the future of the region today. And the reason why I do this, I think, because those fault lines express themselves most powerfully and most potently in Syria. They're the following. I mean, state versus society. And anyone who has studied the Syrian uprising and the decades prior to that understands that there has been pretty powerful shifts within Syria that explain why we are today. I mean, one example, for instance, is that Hafez al-Assad essentially used the periphery to control the core, the cities. Bashar al-Assad, because of his program of economic liberalization, corrupt, inefficient, whatever you want to call it, but still, I mean, he was a kid of the towns, the cities essentially, shifted the loyalty, focused on the cities, abandoned the periphery. And it's essentially the periphery and the suburbs of the big cities, etc., that really fed the uprising. So you have a big breakdown. I mean, this is just one example. We can go into much deeper detail about this. So state society. The second issue is, the second fault line is ethnic nationalism, essentially. The failure of the modern Arab state to either accommodate, tame, or defeat, things like the Kurdish nationalism or subnational loyalties and identities, etc., means that today people are looking for protection, for order elsewhere. And there's this whole discourse today about ethnic nationalism, the breakdown of state, perhaps partition, whether it's a de facto partition or engineered partition. That all this talk is intensifying, which I think is a pretty problematic because the way we talk about it is almost in terms of ethnic purity at this point. But that's another issue. The other fault line is Islamism, broadly defined political Islam, versus secularism. I mean, I would warn people about this whole concept of secularism. What we mean by secularism in the Arab world is very different from the concept of secularism we see in the West today, and for a number of reasons. For me, seculars in the Arab world are primarily lifestyle seculars, and second, it's about the political game, much more than intrinsic values. You know, the secularists in the Arab world are not necessarily Democrats, they're not necessarily progressive, they're not necessarily liberals. These are different concepts that we have to you know, examine independently one from the other. There's some overlap, not enough. The other fault line are the risks that you identified within Islamism, and including the extreme end of Islamism, which shouldn't actually, technically not necessarily Islamism, jihadism. Jihadism is a very revisionist idea. It rejects the modern, the concept of the modern state borders. I mean, what Daesh did early on is announce the caliphate, you know, just very revisionist, very fundamental on this issue. But within Islamism, there is violent Islamism and non-violent Islamism. There's also a very powerful debate going on. The other issue, and you know, if in some places the emphasis is put on that rift, is the whole Sunni-Shia dialectic. I would warn people not to use this as the primary prism to understand the region. I'll explain in more detail why. But you know, people cannot say, I mean, sectarianism may not have been the main catalyst or a deep force early on in the disintegration of all these states. You know, we should point to governance and lack of opportunity, etc. But, you know, after a certain time, sectarianism becomes a de facto driver. Now, it's not necessarily a crystallized concept. It doesn't necessarily mean what people think it means, and it doesn't have the power, but we have to recognize this. I mean, you know, I usually tell the story about Syria before the uprising. Whenever I would talk to Syrian relatives or friends or interlocutors, whatever, they would look at me and say, you, the Lebanese, you're sectarian, violent, you have no sense of the nation, the state, etc. And my point is, okay, well taken. But their implication is that they were different. That, you know, well, the ingredients for such violence and disintegration are actually present everywhere. It really depends on a set of circumstances for them to ignite in some way or another. So no society in the Arab world has achieved that level of, you know, nationhood and inclusiveness and belonging. And Syria is, and so, you know, sectarianism really thrived on this. And finally, the fault line, and that's the one I'm going to examine now, is the Iran versus Saudi rivalry, which I think today is a key driver in regional conflict. It's a key one because it basically exacerbates and instrumentalizes sectarianism, or, you know, you can say weaponizes sectarianism. It's a divide that basically demands of various regional actors, whether they're state actors or non-state actors, to take sides and commit to this or that camp, regardless sometimes of their local conditions, their local preferences, their local makeup. We feel this in Lebanon for sure. It's also a rivalry that constrains what other regional powers, but also international powers, can do or in the region. I mean, their actions. So, for instance, if you talk to some Saudis, you know, when they talk about France's greater profile in the region today, they say, "Oh, France supports the Sunni axis in the region that we lead." Go talk to the French, and they say, "No, this is not how we see our engagement. It's about, you know, cold-blooded, well-defined interests. You know, some of them are security, strategic, some of them are commercial, etc. But they don't necessarily adopt the prism, and that matters enormously. So, but still, at the moment, it's undeniable that Saudi and Iran are the two powerhouses in the region. And their rivalry is multidimensional. It takes very many forms, and it shapes what local, state, and external actors can do and how they behave. Now, the funny thing about these two countries is that in many ways they mirror each other, imperfectly, but one has to look at this dimension. I would say that they almost share a similar self-image. Both of them pose as the ultimate Islamic champion, very differently, but still there is this very powerful claim. Both want to be the cornerstone of the regional order, and both want to be the prime interlocutor of external powers. They want to be the one setting the regional order, and they want, I don't know when it's going to happen, but you know, the US Secretary of State, if he comes to the region, he would have to first stop to Riyadh and then fly to Tehran, or fly first to Tehran and then go to Riyadh. I mean, it's very schematic, but you can tell what I mean is that they want to have the key say in how external powers approach the region. Now, before I get precisely to Syria, I think it's important to understand the regional landscape from the perspective of both Saudi and Iran. The great game in the region is not happening in the Gulf today, although both are Gulf powers, for a number of reasons. The first one is that the Gulf is an internationalized arena. It's a place, the stability of the Gulf is a global public good. So there's a lot invested in there to prevent conflict. The second factor is US military dominance. We can talk about the US commitment under this administration, future ones, different levels of commitment, different natures of commitment in the region. But for the moment, the US is the dominant military power in the region. So it's very difficult to see a direct conflict that wouldn't involve the US in a pretty decisive way. Not necessarily sustainable, but decisive. The other issue is that the direct cost of war in the Gulf is just massive. I mean, you know, if you're looking at energy issues, if you're looking in terms of infrastructure, and you're looking at damage, look at the military capabilities, the conventional military capabilities of the various actors, the war would be extremely damaging. Another factor is the relative wealth and strengths of the states in the Gulf. I mean, you know, we can talk a lot about the challenges the Saudi, Kuwait, other countries face. They're not there. They're not yet at the facing the challenges that we see in the Levant or in North Africa. So that matters. There is not the same opening for conflict. Now, the regional balance of power is not going to change in Yemen also. Yemen is important for the security of the Arabian Peninsula. It's important in terms of direct security terms and potential security threats in the future. But Yemen is not at the heart of the current balance of power. If you win in Yemen, and I don't know how one would define victory in Yemen, but let's pretend there is this, there is no carryover effect. You win in Yemen, it doesn't mean that you win something that you can shop around or so we have to look at Yemen in a much more, it's extremely important. You go to Saudi, I was just there, it's very much undermined, and I can understand why. We can, you know, agree or disagree with the intervention and whatever, but that's a different matter. What I'm saying is winning in Yemen doesn't mean you win in the Middle East, whatever that means again. So the main battlefield, not just by default, I think by default, but also by design, are the weak states and divided societies of the Levant. For a very long time, it was here, other places, and now it's Syria. Why is it Syria? Because those fault lines that Paul identified and that I totally agree with express themselves most powerfully there. It's the perfect children. It's the place where, you know, all our worst nightmares unfold in many ways. I mean, you know, not necessarily nightmares. You know, the state-society one can play out in very positive ways. But, you know, just anyone looking at the current situation cannot be but very pessimistic. So let's look at Syria. What was early on the Saudi rationale? Not early on, because, you know, you have to give the Saudis credit. The first 6 months, they were not trying to shake the Assad regime. They didn't pursue a regime change strategy, contrary to what you hear here or in Damascus and on the Mayadeen and other mediums. The Saudis were actually quite cautious early on. But then over time, several strategic rationales for jumping into Syria and really embracing this struggle and investing in it, etc., started to take shape. The first one is obviously, and I'll detail this a bit more, to check Iranian expansionism, real or imagined. I mean, you have to take this, it may be inflated, but it was a genuine sentiment. The second one is and one can, again, debate this point, but I think this is how they saw it, is to compensate for the loss of Iraq. Iraq was a bulwark. Even Saddam Hussein's Iraq, a very antagonistic Iraq, was still a bulwark against Iran. When they lost it, when the Gulf states essentially saw Iraq totally move away from them in 2003 on, what the Gulf states realized at the time is that they didn't have the instruments to affect Iraq's trajectory. I mean, that was too big, and in their minds, let the US handle that one. They didn't invest themselves seriously, politically or practically on the ground, the way people think. If anything, I would blame the Gulf states from withdrawing from Iraq, not accepting the new political realities and try to shape them. But Syria looked like the place where they could compensate for it, very imperfectly, obviously, but that's part of the thinking. The third rationale was that if you win Syria, and again, every time I say this, I don't necessarily know what it means to win, but let's pretend that's okay. You also win Lebanon and Palestine. And here is a very important point to understand. The Saudis and others feel that the politics and demographics of Lebanon in particular were too demanding, too costly. They spent years pouring money, supporting Afi Hariri, trying the game, and there was no real return, right? And that's partly because of the demographics are so complex and the politics are so complex. It's a place where no one really wins in Lebanon. Look at the war. However, when the Saudis saw the uprising, and by the way, this is a calculation not just by the Saudis, but also a couple other Gulf actors. When they saw Syria, the uprising unfold, they thought, look, there is a demographic reality in Syria that plays in our favor. I think they were wrong because they didn't understand Syrian society, but this is how they read it, that we can use over time. And once we win in Syria, that will shape the future politics of Lebanon, the future alignment, strategic alignment of Lebanon and Palestine. And finally, not finally, actually, the other point is they wanted to punish Assad. They tried, they accommodated him for a very long time. When you go to Riyadh, people remind you of scene of 2009, of Abdullah's visit. I mean, of all these attempts to reconcile despite all the bad blood, and they were done. And that was, and finally, strategically, what the Gulf states and Saudi in particular wanted is a pro-Saudi, pro-Gulf government in Damascus, right? The problem is that they didn't necessarily understand Syrian society and the transformations of Syrian society. There is a bias in every government to think that whomever you're talking to is a powerful actor in that country. So if you're the Saudis, you think that the businessmen you're dealing with, whether it was Khaddam or remember Manaf class, anyone they knew was somehow a real player, could deliver something. The Qataris made the same mistake with the Brotherhood. I mean, there is a tendency to think that who matters in the other country. The Turks, a perfect example. Turkey thought that its 10-year relationship with Assad gave it a special insight, understanding in Syrian society that in 2011, especially 2012, they could use to shape the future of Syria. Well, they didn't even understand northern Syria, which is closest to them. But that's natural, but one has to understand the limits of one's knowledge of those very complex societies and dynamics. Now, the Iranian rationale, on the other hand, was simpler because there was a long relationship there. The first one, and I hear this when I go to Tehran and so on, is that, look, Syria is our only real state ally at this point, and we remember the 80s. There is real loyalty to this relationship because of the history. The second one is Iran needed to defend the Assad regime to the end because it needed or it sought at the beginning of the uprising because of how Tehran understood the uprising as an Islamist in nature. I mean, remember the Khamenei statements at the time, that actually standing by Assad would maintain this Arab and Sunni cover that Iran needs to operate in the Middle East, in the Arab world in more broadly. Over time, Iran had to make the peace with the fact that its involvement there cost it a lot of this Arab and Sunni support that it had courted for a very long time. Another issue here is that we have a tendency to describe the Syria-Iran alliance that started in the 80s and Purdue as a marriage of convenience, and I hate that term. I generally, because I think it's deceptive and so on. I mean, it's still an alliance that lasted 35 years, many wars, transformation to the regional order, etc. The way I describe it is different. Think of the Iran, and the reason why people do this is because they compare the different natures of the political system. The fact that Iran is a theocracy, Shia, etc., while Syria is this Ba'athist, Sunni Alawite, establishment leading. I mean, there are many differences between the two countries. But that's missing the point. I would argue that the better way to think about this relationship up until today is that it's an arranged marriage in which the two sides ended up falling in love with each other. I mean, that's, that's how I think about it. It worked out better than they believed. So it starts for like tactical or strategic reason, and then it takes a life of its own, and that's what we are today. And finally, I mean, we're in Lebanon. I think Iran was interested in sort of survival of Assad, at least in the short term, to maintain the conduit to Hezbollah, the logistical, political conduit linked to Hezbollah. Now, Iran has, I'm not convinced that Iran is committed to Assad as a person forever, but in the short to medium term, for the foreseeable future, it is. While it's a developing alternative to Assad, should something happen, because Iran, plans. Now, let me break down this rivalry into several factors to actually give you a more practical sense of what I'm talking about. The first driver factor in this rivalry is experience. Now, Iran has extensive experience in terms of this kind of rivalry, operating in countries under civil strife, etc. I mean, it's done that for the past 35 years. Lebanon, Afghanistan, Iraq, now Syria, right? Saudi has very little experience in doing that. The Saudis don't necessarily know how to do this. They don't have the instruments. I'll get to this in a second. So the issue of experience does matter. The second factor is expertise. Iran has a dedicated arm in its state that is funded and that is dedicated to operations abroad of that nature. The Quds Force, the IRGC, and now we see other elements. And Iran knows how to run proxies, whether they're organic allies or more opportunistic one, over time. Hezbollah being the ultimate one. Saudi Arabia has very limited expertise in that. I mean, yes, Saudi does export a form of, Wahhabism, etc., but they export an ideology. They don't necessarily export instruments. They don't necessarily build instruments abroad. It's a very different modus operandi, and we have to understand this. So the Saudis, they co-opt people, they fund people, they work through middlemen, through existing actors, etc. But it's not the same logic of building up a specific groups so that over time it will be a privileged ally in a system. The third factor is strategic patience. What I mean by strategic patience very quickly is the ability to justify huge costs today for return way later under very different circumstances, etc. There's a conceptual and theoretical definition of strategic patience. I'm not going to put you through that one. Essentially, what the Iranians have shown is an ability to stand by their friends in good and bad times, an ability to justify that cost, wait for the return, etc. I would argue that Saudi has very little strategic patience in comparison. It doesn't necessarily invest in long-term relationships. I would say that in Iran, security policy is highly institutionalized. In Saudi Arabia, it's very personalized, and that matters. I mean, we see right now with the change of guard in Saudi Arabia how this is impacting key relationships in the region. Here in Lebanon, Hariri is a good example of that. The fourth factor is what I would call regional state allies. Saudi Arabia has many friends. It has broad support, but I would argue it's actually kind of shallow. Iran has very few friends, but it's deep. And that matters in the regional game. So Iran can get the 22 Arab League states, minus Lebanon, to sign onto a statement condemning Iran for the burning of the embassies, right? But you can't take that, you can't necessarily operationalize that. They get the statement, they get this, but it's not as if countries are necessarily going to invest in that rivalry, I mean, directly put manpower aside. The Gulf states are largely on Saudi's side, but how you operationalize this is very difficult to think. Whereas in the case of Iran, I think its regional state allies they're much fewer, but they're more committed. They're actually aligned on those matters. And what's also important to understand is that Saudi Arabia's friends in the region are not necessarily aligned with everything that Saudi Arabia does or thinks. Look at Egypt, for instance, which is hugely dependent today on Saudi political and financial assistance, but totally disagrees with Riyadh on Syria, which Saudi portrays as the main issue. So, that's just one example. The fifth factor is regional non-state allies. Iran has organic, disciplined, ideological allies in the region, and allies that can be deployed. Look at Hezbollah, look at Iraqi Shia militias, look at Afghans, etc. Saudi Arabia doesn't play in the same league at all. It doesn't have those non-state allies that you can shift from one place to another, that are responsive, that do exactly this. If anything, the problem with Saudi Arabia is how chaotic its policy, the implementation of its policies are. The sixth factor are external allies. I would argue that Iran has a much more reliable, in the short term, ally in Russia, given the convergence today, than Saudi. Saudi is wondering whether its alliance with the U.S. will deliver. They worry that the commitment to Saudi security will weaken over time. The U.S. has very clearly announced that it will no longer promote or defend Saudi Arabia's regional interests. I mean, that, I think, is the real takeaway of the Obama doctrine, I mean, in policy terms, of the Obama doctrine article, is that we'll protect you. That's essentially what Obama said when he went to Riyadh, but we're not going to advance your regional interests. The seventh factor, I promise I will be short after this, the seventh factor is the one of resources. Both have resources, but I would argue Iran's resources are kind of limited. But Iran operates at a much lower cost than Saudi Arabia. I mean, the cost of proxies is much lower than the cost of direct intervention. I mean, the intervention in Yemen is costing billions a month. I mean, I put the numbers down. I won't tell you because I still need to check, a bit everything. Yazid is looking at me here, and he knows that my bosses in London would be, not happy if I were to come up with numbers. But everyone asks about those things. But the order of magnitude is massive between what Iran spends in Syria even to sustain the Assad regime and what Saudi and the UAE and others are spending in Yemen for their own operation. So Saudi has a lot more resources, but it costs a lot more for them to operate regionally. Whereas Iran, because of its strategies, its asymmetric strategy and support for proxies, can do it at a much lower level. And finally, I think that's an important point to understand, is that it's what I call the domestic security, ideological, and such security backlash. In Iran, those who are running the show are at the extreme end of the political spectrum. Essentially, when Iran operates in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq, etc., the current elite that articulates and implements those policies are not afraid of being bypassed to the right by someone else in the system. They are at the extreme right of the system. When it comes to Saudi, they're not at the extreme right of the system. But the second point is that what Saudi does, in a way, exacerbates or empowers people who, over time, become ideological or security threat to Saudi Arabia itself. Not only they create chaos elsewhere, I mean, how the jihadis and so on, and I want to be very clear, there's no evidence of Saudi support for ISIS or all this stuff. I mean, let's cut this conversation very short here. But what I'm saying is that when Saudi Arabia intervenes somewhere, by default, unintentionally, it feeds the very forces that end up challenging Saudi Arabia from within the kingdom or in the region. So they can always be bypassed to the right. So, what I try to do here is really I didn't want to do a historical presentation on how the rivalry unfolded in Syria. I've written on that, so you can. But I think it's more interesting and more important to break down the rivalries through these various factors, because we have a tendency of having a very linear narrative, or the way the Saudi position or the Iranian position go up and down, a very self-serving reading of all these dynamics. And I think it's important to also keep the structural aspect in mind, to think of those two actors as rational, at times competent, often incompetent state, to create dynamics that are not necessarily in control. Now, I would argue that all in all, Iran is in a better place than Saudi today, but not necessarily just because of Iran, because of a number of other calculations in Washington, in Moscow, in Western capitals, and other Arab capitals today. Iran has, I think, a clearer vision for an end goal in the short, medium, and long term in Syria than Saudi does at this point. I think that's the key matter. So Saudi, in effect, is largely dependent on what its main allies do, because it itself cannot shape the future of Syria. Iran can shape, to some extent, the future of mini-states in Syria, and that's the difference. So thank you. I spoke way too long, but thanks for the attention.
I want to thank our panelists, Paul and Emile. Really, thank you for sharing your insight. Paul, it's always great to have you back. Emile, I'm very happy that LCPS, was the first invitation in Lebanon. This is a pleasure. Thank you very much for everyone.